Chapter 13 of the Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 13. Jana. No breakfast was brought to us that morning, probably for the reason that there was none to bring. This did not matter, however, seeing that plenty of food accumulated from supper and other meals stood in a corner of the house practically untouched. So we ate what we could, then paid our usual visit to the hut in which the camelman had been confined. I say had been, but now it was quite empty, the last poor fellow having vanished away like his companions. The sight of this vacuum filled me with a kind of fury. "They have all been murdered," I said to Marût. "No," he replied with gentle accuracy. "They have been sacrificed to Jana. What we have seen on the market-place at night was the rite of their sacrifice. Now it will be our turn, Lord Macumazana." "Well," I exclaimed, "I hope these devils are satisfied with Jana's answer to their accursed offerings, and if they try their fiendish pranks on us—" "Doubtless there will be another answer. But, Lord, the question is, will that help us?" Dumb with impotent rage, I returned to the house where presently the remains of the reed gate opened. Through it appeared Simba the King, the diviner with the injured foot walking upon crutches, and others of whom the most were more or less wounded, presumably by the hailstones. Then it was that in my wrath I put off the pretence of not understanding their language and went for them before they could utter a single word. "Where are our servants, you murderers?" I asked, shaking my fist at them. "Have you sacrificed them to your devil god? If so, behold the fruits of sacrifice," and I swept my arm towards the country beyond. "Where are your crops?" I went on. "Tell me what you will live on this winter." At these words they quailed. In their imagination already they saw famine stalking towards them. "Why do you keep us here? Is it that you wait for a worse thing to befall you? Why do you visit us here now?" And I paused, gasping with indignation. "We came to look whether you had brought back to life that doctor whom you killed with your magic, white man," answered the king heavily. I stepped to the corner of the courtyard and drawing aside the mat that I had thrown there, showed them what lay beneath. "Look then," I said, "and be sure that if you do not let us go, yonder thing is, so shall all of you be before another moon has been born and died. Such is the life we shall give to evil men like you." Now they grew positively terrified. "Lord," said Simba, for the first time addressing me by a title of respect, "your magic is too strong for us. Great misfortune has fallen upon our land. Hundreds of people are dead, killed by the ice stones that you have called down. Our harvest is ruined, and there is but little corn left in the store pits now when we looked to gather the new grain. Messengers come in from the outlying land telling us that nearly all the sheep and goats and very many of the cattle are slain. Soon we shall starve." "As you deserve to starve," I answered. "Now will you let us go?" Simba stared at me doubtfully, then began to whisper into the ear of the lamed diviner. I could not catch what they said, so I watched their faces. That of the diviner, whose head I was glad to see had been cut by a hailstone, so that both ends of him were now injured, told me a great deal. His mask had been ugly, but now that it was off, the countenance beneath was far uglier. Of a negroid type, pendulous-lipped, sensuous and loose-eyed, he was indeed a very hideous fellow, yet very cunning and very cruel-looking, as men of his class are apt to be. Humbled as he was for the moment, I felt sure that he was still plotting evil against us, somewhat against the will of his master. The issue showed that I was right. At length Simba spoke, saying: "We had intended, Lord, to keep you and the priest of the Child here as hostages against mischief that might be worked on us by the followers of the Child, who have always been our bitter enemies and done us much undeserved wrong, although on our part we have faithfully kept the pact concluded in the days of our grandfathers. It seems, however, that fate or your magic is too strong for us, and therefore I have determined to let you go. Tonight at sundown we will set you on the road which leads to the ford of the river Tava, which divides our territory from that of the White Kendah, and you may depart where you will, since our wish is that never again may we see your ill-omened faces." At this intelligence my heart leapt in joy that was altogether premature, but preserving my indignant air, I exclaimed: "To-night? Why to-night? Why not at once? It is hard for us to cross unknown rivers in the dark." "The water is low, Lord, and the ford easy. Moreover, if you started now you would reach it in the dark, whereas if you start at sundown you will reach it in the morning. Lastly, we cannot conduct you hence until we have buried our dead." Then, without giving me time to answer, he turned and left the place, followed by the others. Only at the gateway the diviner wheeled round on his crutches and glared at us both, muttering something with his thick lips. Probably it was curses. "At any rate they are going to set us free," I said to Marût, not without exultation, when they had all vanished. "Yes, Lord," he replied, "but where are they going to set us free? The demon Jana lives in the forests and the swamps by the banks of the Tava river, and it is said that he ravages at night." I did not pursue the subject, but reflected to myself cheerfully that this mystic rogue elephant was a long way off and might be circumvented, whereas the altar of sacrifice was extremely near and very difficult to avoid. Never did a thief with a rich booty in view, or a wooer having an assignation with his lady, wait for sundown more eagerly than I did that day. Hour after hour I sat upon the housetop, watching the Black Kendah carrying off the dead killed by the hailstones and generally trying to repair the damage done by the terrific tempest. Watching the sun also as it climbed down the cloudless sky and literally counting the minutes till it should reach the horizon, although I knew well that it would have been wiser after such a night to prepare for our journey by lying down to sleep. At length the great orb began to sink in majesty behind the tattered western forest, and punctual to the minute Simba with a mounted escort of some 20 men and 2 led horses appeared at our gate. As our preparations, which consisted only of Marût stuffing such food as was available into the breast of his robe, were already made, we walked out of that accursed guest house and, at a sign from the king, mounted the horses. Riding across the empty marketplace and past the spot where the rough stone altar still stood with charred bones protruding from the ashes of its extinguished fire—were they those of our friends the camel drivers, I wondered—we entered the north street of the town. Here, standing at the doors of their houses, were many of the inhabitants who had gathered to watch us pass. Never did I see hate more savage than was written on those faces as they shook their fists at us and muttered curses not loud but deep. No wonder, for they were all ruined, poor folk, with nothing to look forward to but starvation until long months hence the harvest came again for those who would live to gather it. Also they were convinced that we, the white magician and the prophet of their enemy the Child, had brought this disaster on them. Had it not been for the escort I believe they would have fallen on us and torn us to pieces. Considering them, I understood for the first time how disagreeable real unpopularity can be. But when I saw the actual conditions of the fruitful gardens without in the waning daylight, I confess that I was moved to some sympathy with their owners. It was appalling. Not a handful of grain was left there to gather, for the corn had been not only laid but literally cut to ribbons by the hail. After running for some miles through cultivated land, the road entered the forest. Here it was dark as pitch, so dark that I wondered how our guides found their way. In that blackness dreadful apprehensions seized me, for I became convinced that we had been brought here to be murdered. Every minute I expected to feel a knife thrust in my back. I thought of digging my heels into the horses' sides and trying to gallop off anywhere, but abandoned the idea. First because I could not desert Marût, of whom I had lost touch in the gloom, and secondly because I was hemmed in by the escort. For the same reason I did not try to slip from the horse and glide away into the forest. There was nothing to be done save to go on and await the end. It came at last, some hours later. We were out of the forest now and there was the moon rising, past her full but still very bright. Her light showed me that we were on a wild moorland, swampy, with scattered trees growing here and there, across which what seemed to be a game track ran down the hill. That was all I could make out. Here the escort halted and Simba the King said in a sullen voice: "Dismount and go your ways, evil spirits, for we travel no further across this place which is haunted. Follow the track and it will lead you to a lake. Pass the lake and by morning you will come to the river beyond which lies the country of your friends. May its waters swallow you if you reach them. For learn, there is one who watches on this road whom few care to meet." As he finished speaking, men sprang at us and, pulling us from the horses, thrust us out of their company. Then they turned and in another minute were lost in the darkness, leaving us alone. "What now, friend Marût?" I asked. "Now, Lord, all we can do is go forward, for if we stay here Simba and his people will return and kill us at the daylight. One of them said so to me." "Then come on, Macduff," I exclaimed, stepping out briskly, and though he had never read Shakespeare, Marût understood and followed. "What did Simba mean about one on the road whom few care to meet?" I asked over my shoulder when we had done half a mile or so. "I think he meant the elephant Jana," replied Marût with a groan. "Then I hope Jana isn't at home. Cheer up, Marût, the chances are that we shall never meet a single elephant in this big place." "Yet many elephants have been here, Lord," and he pointed to the ground. "It is said that they come to die by the waters of the lake, and this is one of the roads they follow on their death journey, a road that no other living thing dare travel." "Oh!" I exclaimed. "Then after all that was a true dream I had in the house in England." "Yes, Lord, because my brother Harût once lost his way out hunting when he was young and saw what his mind showed you in the dream, and what we shall see presently, if we live to come so far." I made no reply, both because what he said was either true or false, which I should ascertain presently, and because I was engaged in searching the ground with my eyes. He was right. Many elephants had travelled this path, one quite recently. I, a hunter of those brutes, could not be deceived on this point. Once or twice also I thought that I caught sight of the outline of some tall creature moving silently through the scattered thorns a couple of 100 yards or so to our right. It might have been an elephant or a giraffe, or perhaps nothing but a shadow, so I said nothing. As I heard no noise, I was inclined to believe the latter explanation. In any case, what was the good of speaking? Unarmed and solitary amidst unknown dangers, our position was desperate, and as Marût's nerve was already giving out, to emphasize its horrors to him would be mere foolishness. On we trudged for another 2 hours, during which time the only living thing that I saw was a large owl which sailed round our heads as though to look at us, and then flew away ahead. This owl, Marût informed me, was one of Jana's spies, that kept him advised of all that was passing in his territory. I muttered "bosh" and tramped on. Still I was glad that we saw no more of the owl, for in certain circumstances such dark fears are catching. We reached the top of a rise, and there beneath us lay the most desolate scene that I have ever seen. At least it would have been the most desolate if I did not chance to have looked on it before, in the drawing room of Ragnall Castle. There was no doubt about it. Below was the black, melancholy lake, a large sheet of water surrounded by reeds. Around, but at a considerable distance, appeared the tropical forest. To the east of the lake stretched a stony plain. At the time I could make out no more because of the uncertain light and the distance, for we had still over a mile to go before we reached the edge of the lake. The aspect of the place filled me with tremblings, both because of its utter uncanniness and because of the inexplicable truth that I had seen it before. Most people will have experienced this kind of moral shock when on going to some new land they recognize a locality as being quite familiar to them in all its details. Or it may be the rooms of a house hitherto unvisited by them. Or it may be a conversation of which, when it begins, they already foreknow the sequence and the end, because in some dim state, when or how, who can say, they have taken part in that talk with those same speakers. If this be so even in cheerful surroundings and among our friends or acquaintances, it is easy to imagine how much greater was the shock to me, a traveller on such a journey and in such a night. I shrank from approaching the shores of this lake, remembering that as yet all the vision was not unrolled. I looked about me. As we went to the left we should either strike the water, or if we followed its edge, still bearing to the left, must ultimately reach the forest, where probably we should be lost. I looked to the right. The ground was strewn with boulders, among which grew thorns and rank grass, impracticable for men on foot at night. I looked behind me, meditating retreat, and there, some hundreds of yards away behind low scrubby mimosas mixed with aloe-like plants, I saw something brown toss up and disappear again that might very well have been the trunk of an elephant. Then, animated by the courage of despair and a desire to know the worst, I began to descend the elephant track toward the lake almost at a run. 10 minutes or so more brought us to the eastern head of the lake, where the reeds whispered in the breath of the night wind like things alive. As I expected, it proved to be a bare open space where nothing seemed to grow. Yes, and all about me were the decaying remains of elephants, hundreds of them, some with their bones covered in moss that may have lain here for generations, and others more newly dead. They were all old beasts, as I could tell by the tusks, whether male or female. Indeed, about me within a radius of a quarter of a mile lay enough ivory to make a man very rich for life, since although discoloured, much of it seemed to have kept quite sound, like human teeth in a mummy case. The sight gave me a new zest for life. If only I could manage to survive and carry off that ivory, I would. In this way or in that I swore that I would. Who could possibly die with so much ivory to be had for the taking? Not that old hunter, Allan Quatermain. Then I forgot about the ivory, for there in front of me, just where it should be, just as I had seen it in the dream picture, was the bull elephant dying, a thin and ancient brute that had lived its long life to the last hour. It searched about as though to find a convenient resting place, and when this was discovered, stood over it, swayed to and fro for a full minute. Then it lifted its trunk and trumpeted shrilly thrice, singing its swan song, after which it sank slowly to its knees, its trunk outstretched and the points of its worn tusks resting on the ground. Evidently it was dead. I let my eyes travel on and behold, about 50 yards beyond the dead bull was a mound of hard rock. I watched it with gasping expectation and, yes, on the top of the mound something slowly materialized. Although I knew what it must be well enough, for a while I could not see quite clearly because there were certain little clouds about, and one of them had floated over the face of the moon. It passed, and before me, perhaps 140 paces away, outlined clearly against the sky, I perceived the devilish elephant of my vision. Oh, what a brute that was! In bulk and height it appeared to be half as big again as any of its tribe which I had known in all my life's experience. It was enormous, unearthly, a survivor perhaps of some ancient species that lived before the flood, or at least a very giant of its kind. Its grey-black sides were scarred as though with fighting. One of its huge tusks, much worn at the end, for evidently it was very old, gleamed white in the moonlight. The other was broken off about halfway down its length. When perfect it had been malformed, for it curved downwards and not upwards, also rather out to the right. There stood this mammoth, this leviathan, this monstrum horrendum in forma ingens, as I remember my old father used to call a certain gigantic and misshapen bull that we had on the station, flapping a pair of ears that looked like the sides of a Kaffir hut and waving a trunk as big as a weaver's beam, whatever a weaver's beam may be, an appalling and a petrifying sight. I squatted behind the skeleton of an elephant which happened to be handy and well covered with moss and ferns, and watched the beast, fascinated, wishing that I had a large bore rifle in my hand. What became of Marût I do not exactly know, but I think that he lay down on the ground. During the minute or so that followed I reflected a good deal, as we do in times of emergency, often after a useless sort of a fashion. For instance, I wondered why the brute appeared thus upon yonder mound, and the thought suggested itself to me that it was summoned thither from some neighbouring lair by the trumpet call of the dying elephant. It occurred to me even that it was a kind of king of the elephants, to which they felt bound to report themselves, as it were, in the hour of their decease. Certainly what followed gave some credence to my fantastical notion which, if there were anything in it, might account for this great graveyard at that particular spot. After standing for a while in the attitude that I have described, testing the air with its trunk, Jana, for I will call him so, lumbered down the mound and advanced straight to where the elephant that I had thought to be dead was kneeling. As a matter of fact it was not quite dead, for when Jana arrived it lifted its trunk and curled it round that of Jana as though in affectionate greeting, then let it fall to the ground again. Thereon Jana did what I had seen it do in my dream or vision at Ragnall, namely attacked it, knocking it over onto its side where it lay motionless, quite dead this time. Now I remembered that the vision was not accurate after all, since in it I had seen Jana destroy a woman and a child, who on the present occasion were wanting. Since then I have thought that this was because Harût, clairvoyantly or telepathically, had conveyed to me, as indeed Marût declared, a scene which he had witnessed similar to that which I was witnessing, but not identical in its incidents. Thus it happened, perhaps, that while the act of the woman and the child was omitted, in our case there was another act of the play to follow of which I had received no inkling in my Ragnall experience. Indeed, if I had received it, I should not have been there that night, for no inducement on earth would have brought me to Kenderland. This was the act. Jana, having prodded his dead brother to his satisfaction, whether from viciousness or to put it out of pain, I cannot say, stood over the carcass in an attitude of grief or pious meditation. At this time, I should mention, the wind, which had been rustling the hail-ripped reeds at the lake border, had died away almost, but not completely. That is to say, only a very faint gust blew now and again, which, with a hunter's instinct, I observed with satisfaction, drew from the direction of Jana towards ourselves. This I knew because it struck on my forehead, which was wet with perspiration, and cooled the skin. Presently, however, by a cursed spite of fate, one of these gusts, a very little one, came from some quarter behind us, for I felt it in my back hair that was damp as the rest of me. Just then I was glancing to my right, where it seemed to me that out of the corner of my eye I had caught sight of something passing among the stones at a distance of 100 yards or so, possibly the shadow of a cloud or another elephant. At the time I did not ascertain which it was, since a faint rattle from Jana's trunk reconcentrated all my faculties on him in a painfully vivid fashion. I looked to see that all the contemplation had departed from his attitude, now as alert as that of a fox terrier which imagines he has seen a rat. His vast ears were cocked, his huge bulk trembled, his enormous trunk sniffed the air. Great heavens, thought I to myself, he has winded us. Then I took such consolation as I could from the fact that the next gust once more struck upon my forehead, for I hoped he would conclude that he had made a mistake. Not a bit of it. Jana was far too old a bird or beast to make any mistake. He grunted, got himself going like a luggage train and with great deliberation walked towards us, smelling at the ground, smelling at the air, smelling to the right, to the left, and even towards heaven above, as though he expected that thence might fall upon him vengeance for his many sins. A dozen times as he came did I cover him with an imaginary rifle, marking the exact spots where I might have hoped to send a bullet to his vitals in a kind of automatic fashion, for all my real brain was contemplating my own approaching end. I wondered how it would happen. Would he drive that great tusk through me? Would he throw me into the air, or would he kneel upon my poor little body and avenge the deaths of his kin that had fallen at my hands? Marût was speaking in a rattling whisper. "The priests have told Jana to kill us. We are about to die," he said. "Before I die, I want to say that the lady, the wife of the Lord—" "Silence!" I hissed. "He will hear you." For at that instant I took not the slightest interest in any lady on the earth. Fiercely I glared at Marût and noted even then how pitiful was his countenance. There was no smile there now. All its jovial roundness had vanished. It had sunk in. It was blue and ghastly with large protruding eyes, like to that of a man who had been 3 days dead. I was right. Jana had heard. Low as the whisper was, through that intense silence it had penetrated to his almost preternatural senses. Forward he came at a run for 20 paces or more, with his trunk held straight out in front of him. Then he halted again, perhaps the length of a cricket pitch away, and smelt as before. The sight was too much for Marût. He sprang up and ran for his life towards the lake, purposing, I suppose, to take refuge in the water. Oh, how he ran! After him went Jana like a railway engine, express this time, trumpeting as he charged. Marût reached the lake, which was quite close, about 10 yards ahead, and plunging into it with a bound, began to swim. Now, I thought, he may get away if the crocodiles don't have him, for that devil will scarcely take to the water. But this was just where I made a mistake, for with a mighty splash in went Jana too. Also he was a better swimmer. Marût soon saw this and swung round to the shore, by which manoeuvre he gained a little as he could turn quicker than Jana. Back they came, Jana just behind Marût, striking at him with his great trunk. They landed. Marût flew a few yards ahead, doubling in and out among the rocks like a hare, and, to my horror, making for where I lay, whether by accident or in a mad hope of obtaining protection I do not know. It may be asked why I had not taken the opportunity to run also in the opposite direction. There are several answers. The first was that there seemed to be nowhere to run. The second that I felt sure if I did run, I should trip up over the skeletons of those elephants or the stones. The third that I did not think of it at once. The fourth that Jana had not yet seen me and I had no craving to introduce myself to him personally. And the fifth and greatest, that I was so paralysed with fear that I did not feel as though I could lift myself from the ground. Everything about me seemed to be dead, except my powers of observation, which were painfully alive. Of a sudden Marût gave up. Less than a stone's throw from me he wheeled round and facing Jana hurled at him some fearful and concentrated curse, of which all I could distinguish were the words, "The Child." Oddly enough it seemed to have an effect upon the furious rogue, which halted in its rush and, putting its 4 feet together, slid a few paces nearer and stood still. It was just as though the beast had understood the words and were considering them. If so, their effect was to rouse him to perfect madness. He screamed terribly, he lashed his sides with his trunk, his red and wicked eyes rolled, foam flew from the cavern of his open mouth, he danced upon his great feet, a sort of hideous Scottish reel. Then he charged. I shut my eyes for a moment. When I opened them again it was to see poor Marût higher in the air than ever he flew before. I thought that he would never come down, but he did at last with an awesome thud. Jana went to him and, very gently now that he was dead, picked him up in his trunk. I prayed that he might carry him away to some hiding place and leave me in peace. But not so. With slow and steady strides, rocking the deceased Marût up and down in his trunk as a nurse might rock a baby, he marched on to the very stone where I lay, behind which I suppose he had seen or smelt me all the time. For quite a long while, it seemed more than a century, he stood over me, studying me as though I interested him very much, the water of the lake trickling in a refreshing stream from his great ears on to my back. Had it not been for that water I think I should have fainted, but as it was I did the next best thing, pretended to be dead. Perhaps this monster would scorn to touch a dead man. Watching out of the corner of my eye I saw him lift one vast paw that was the size of an armchair and hold it over me. Now goodbye to the world, thought I. Then the foot descended as a steam hammer does, but also as a steam hammer sometimes does when used to crack nuts, stopped as it touched my back, and presently came to earth again alongside of me, perhaps because Jana thought the foothold dangerous. At any rate he took another and better way. Depositing the remains of Marût with the most tender care beside me, as though the nurse were putting the child to bed, he unwound his yards of trunk and began to feel me all over with its tip, commencing at the back of my neck. Oh, the sensation of that clammy, wriggling tip upon my spinal column! Down it went till it reached the seat of my trousers. There it pinched, presumably to ascertain whether or no I were malingering, a most agonizing pinch like to that of a pair of blacksmith's tongs. So sharp was it that, although I did not stir who was aware that the slightest movement meant death, it tore a piece out of the stout cloth of my breeches, to say nothing of a portion of the skin beneath. This seemed to astonish the beast, for it lifted the tip of its trunk and shifted its head as though to examine the fragment by the light of the moon. Now indeed all was over, for when it saw blood upon that cloth, I put up one short piteous prayer to heaven to save me from this terrible end, and lo! it was answered. For just as Jana, the results of the inspection being unsatisfactory, was cocking his ears and making ready to slay me, there rang out the short, sharp report of a rifle fired within a few yards. Glancing up at the instant, I saw blood spurt from the monster's left eye, where evidently the bullet had found a home. He felt at his eye with his trunk, then uttering a scream of pain, wheeled round and rushed away. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Chase. I suppose that I swooned for a minute or two. At any rate I remember a long and very curious dream, such a dream as is evolved by a patient under laughing gas, that is very clear and vivid at the time but immediately afterwards slips from the mind's grasp as does water from the clenched hand. It was something to the effect that those hundreds of skeleton elephants rose and marshalled themselves before me, making obeisance to me by bending their bony knees, because, as I quite understood, I was the only human being that had ever escaped from Jana. Moreover, on the foremost elephant's skull Hans was perched like a mahout, giving words of command to their serried ranks and explaining to them that it would be very convenient if they would carry their tusks, for which they had no further use, and pile them in a certain place, I forget where, that must be near to a good road to facilitate their subsequent transport to a land where they would be made into billiard balls and the backs of ladies' hairbrushes. Next, through the figments of that retreating dream, I heard the undoubted voice of Hans himself, which of course I knew to be absurd, as Hans was lost and doubtless dead, saying, "If you are alive, Baas, please wake up soon, as I have finished reloading Intombi and it is time to be going. I think I hit Jana in the eye, but so big a beast will soon get over so little a thing as that and look for us, and the bullet from Intombi is too small to kill him, Baas, especially as it is not likely that either of us could hit him in the other eye." Now I sat up and stared. Yes, there was Hans himself, looking just the same as usual, only perhaps rather dirtier, engaged in setting a cap on to the nipple of that little rifle Intombi. "Hans," I said in a hollow voice, "why the devil are you here?" "To save you from the devil, of course, Baas," he replied aptly. Then resting the gun against the stone, the old fellow knelt down by my side and throwing his arms around me began to blubber over me, exclaiming, "Just in time, Baas, only just in time, for as usual Hans made a mess of things and judged badly. I'll tell you afterwards. Still just in time, thanks be to your reverend father the predicant. Oh, if he had delayed me for one more minute you would have been as flat as my nose, Baas. Now come quickly. I've got the camel tied up here and he can carry two, being fat and strong after 4 days' rest with plenty to eat. This place is haunted, Baas, and that king of the devils, Jana, will be back after us presently, as soon as he has wiped the blood out of his eye." I didn't make any remark, having no taste for conversation just then, but only looked at poor Marût, who lay by me as though he were sleeping. "Oh, Baas," said Hans, "there is no need to trouble about him, for his neck is broken and he is quite dead. Also, it is as well," he added cheerfully, "for as your reverend father doubtless remembered, the camel could never carry three. Moreover, if he stops here, poor Jana will come back to play with him instead of following us." Poor Marût! This was his requiem as sung by Hans. With a last glance at the unhappy man to whom I had grown attached in a way during our time of joint captivity and trial, I took the arm of the old Hottentot, or rather leant upon his shoulder, for at first I felt too weak to walk by myself, and picked my path with him through the stones and skeletons of elephants, across the plateau eastwards, that is, away from the lake. About 200 yards from the scene of our tragedy was a mound of rock similar to that on which Jana had appeared, but much smaller, behind which we found the camel, kneeling as a well-trained beast of the sort should do, and tethered to a stone. As we went, in brief but sufficient language, Hans told me his story. It seemed that after he shot the Kender general it came into his cunning, foreseeing mind that he might be of more use to me free than as a companion in captivity, or that if I were killed he might in that case live to bring vengeance on my slayers. So he broke away, as has been described, and hid till nightfall on the hillside. Then by the light of the moon he tracked us, avoiding the villages, and ultimately found a place of shelter in a kind of cave in the forest near Simba town, where no people lived. Here he fed the camel at night, concealing it at dawn in the cave. The days he spent up a tall tree, whence he could watch all that went on in the town beneath, living meanwhile on some food which he carried in a bag tied to the saddle, helped out by green mealies which he stole from a neighbouring field. Thus he saw most of what passed in the town, including the desolation wrought by the fearful tempest of hail, which, being in their cave, both he and the camel escaped without harm. On the next evening from his post of outlook up the tree, where he had now some difficulty in hiding himself because the hail had stripped off all of its leaves, he saw Marût and myself brought from the guest house and taken away by the escort. Descending and running to the cave, he saddled the camel and started in pursuit, plunging into the forest and hiding there when he perceived that the escort were leaving us. Here he waited until they had gone by on their return journey. So close did they pass to him that he could overhear their talk, which told him they expected, or rather were sure, that we should be destroyed by the elephant Jana, their devil god, to whom the camel-men had already been sacrificed. After they had departed he remounted and followed us. Here I asked him why he had not overtaken us before we came to the cemetery of elephants, as I presumed he might have done, since he stated that he was close to our rear. This indeed was the case, for it was the head of the camel I saw behind the thorn trees when I looked back, and not the trunk of an elephant as I had supposed. At the time he would give me no direct answer, except that he grew muddled as he had already suggested, and thought it best to keep in the background and see what happened. Long afterwards he admitted to me that he acted on a presentiment. "It seemed to me, Baas," he said, "that your reverend father was telling me that I should do best to let you two go on and not show myself, since if I did so we should all three be killed, as one of us must walk whom the other two could not desert. Whereas if I left you as you were, one of you would be killed and the other escape, and that the one to be killed would not be you, Baas. All of which came about as the Spirit spoke to my head, for Marût was killed, who did not matter, and you know the rest, Baas." To return to Hans' story. He saw us march down to the borders of the lake and, keeping to our right, took cover behind the knoll of rock, whence he watched also all that followed. When Jana advanced to attack us, Hans crept forward in the hope, a very wild one, of crippling him with the little Purdey rifle. Indeed, he was about to fire at the hind leg when Marût made his run for life and plunged into the lake. Then he crawled on to lead me away to the camel, but when he was within a few yards the chase returned our way and Marût was killed. From that moment he waited for an opportunity to shoot Jana in the only spot where so soft a bullet would, as he knew, have the faintest chance of injuring him vitally, namely in the eye. For he was sure that its penetration would not be sufficient to reach the vitals through that thick hide and the mass of flesh behind. With an infinite and wonderful patience he waited, knowing that my life or death hung in the balance. While Jana held his foot over me, while he felt me with his trunk, still Hans waited, balancing the arguments for and against firing upon the scales of experience in his clever old mind, and in the end coming to a right and wise conclusion. At length his chance came. The brute exposed his eye, and by the light of the clear moon Hans, always a very good shot at a distance when it was not necessary to allow for trajectory and wind, let drive and hit. The bullet did not get to the brain as he had hoped, he had not the strength for that, but it destroyed this left eye and gave Jana such pain that for a while he forgot all about me and everything else except escape. Such was the Hottentot's tale as I picked up from his laconic, colourless Dutch patois sentences. Then and afterwards, a very wonderful tale, I thought. But for him, his fidelity and his bushman's cunning, where should I have found myself before that moon set? We mounted the camel after I had paused a minute to take a pull from a flask of brandy which remained in the saddlebags. Although he loved strong drink so well, Hans had saved it untouched on the mere chance that it might some time be of service to me, his master. The monkey-like Hottentot sat in front and directed the camel, while I accommodated myself as best I could on the sheepskins behind. Luckily they were thick and soft, for Jana's pinch was not exactly that of a lover. Off we went, picking our way carefully till we reached the elephant track beyond the mound where Jana had appeared, which, in the light of faith, we hoped would lead us to the river Tava. Here we made better progress, but still could not go very fast because of the holes made by the feet of Jana and his company. Soon we had left the cemetery behind us and lost the sight of the lake which I devoutly trusted I might never see again. Now the track ran upwards from the hollow to a ridge 2 or 3 miles away. We reached the crest of this ridge without accident, except that on our road we met another aged elephant, a cow with very poor tusks, travelling to its last resting place, or so I suppose. I don't know which was the more frightened, the sick cow or the camel, for camels hate elephants as horses hate camels until they get used to them. The cow bolted to the right as quickly as it could, which was not very fast, and the camel bolted to the left with such convulsive bounds that we were nearly thrown off its back. However, being an equable brute, it soon recovered its balance, and we got back to the track beyond the cow. From the top of the rise we saw that before us lay a sandy plain lightly clothed in grass, and to our joy, about 10 miles away at the foot of a very gentle slope, the moonlight gleamed upon the waters of a broad river. It was not easy to make out, but it was there. We were both sure it was there. We could not mistake the wavering, silvering flash. On we went for another quarter of a mile, when something caused me to turn round on the sheepskin and look back. Oh, heavens! At the very top of the rise, clearly outlined against the sky, stood Jana himself with his trunk lifted. Next instant he trumpeted a furious rattling challenge of rage and defiance. "Almighty Baas," said Hans, "the old devil is coming to look for his lost eye and has seen us with what remains. He has been travelling on our spoor." "Forward," I answered, bringing my heels into the camel's ribs. Then the race began. The camel was a very good camel, one of the real running breed. Also, as Hans said, it was comparatively fresh, and may moreover have been aware that it was near to the plains where it had been bred. Lastly, the going was now excellent, soft to its spongy feet but not too deep in sand, nor were there any rocks over which it could fall. It went off like the wind, making nothing of our united weights which did not come to more than 200 pounds, or half of what it would carry with ease, being perhaps urged to its top speed by the knowledge that the elephant was behind. For mile after mile we rushed down the plain, but we did not go alone, for Jana came after us like a cruiser after a gunboat. Moreover, swiftly as we travelled, he travelled just a little swifter, gaining say a few yards in every 100. For the last mile before we came to the river bank, half an hour later perhaps, though it seemed to be a week, he was not more than 50 paces to our rear. I glanced back at him, and in the light of the moon, which was growing low, he bore a strange resemblance to a mud cottage with broken chimneys, which were his ears flapping on each side of him, and the yard pump projecting from the upper window. "We shall beat him now, Hans," I said, looking at the broad river which was now close at hand. "Yes, Baas," answered Hans doubtfully and in jerks. "This is a very good camel, Baas. He runs so fast that I have no inside left. I suppose because he smells his wife over that river, to say nothing of death behind him. But, Baas, I am not sure. That devil Jana is still faster than the camel, and he wants to settle for his lost eye, which makes him lively. Also I see stones ahead which are bad for camels. Then there is the river, and I don't know if camels can swim, but Jana can be as Marut learned. Do you think, Baas, that you could manage to sting him with a bullet in his knee, or that great trunk of his, just to give him something to think about besides ourselves?" Thus he prattled on, I believe to occupy my mind and his own, till at length, growing impatient, I replied: "Be silent, donkey. Can I shoot an elephant backward over my shoulder with a rifle meant for springbuck? Hit the camel. Hit it hard." Alas, Hans was right. There were stones at the verge of the river, which doubtless it had washed out in periods of past flood, and presently we were among them. Now a camel, so good on sand that is its native heath, is a worthless brute among stones, over which it slips and flounders. But to Jana these appeared to offer little or no obstacle. At any rate he came over them almost if not quite as fast as before. By the time that we reached the brink of the water he was not more than 10 yards behind. I could even see the blood running down from the socket of his ruined eye. Moreover, at the sight of the foaming but shallow torrent, the camel, a creature unaccustomed to water, pulled up in a mulish kind of way and for a moment refused to stir. Luckily at this instant Jana let off one of his archangel kind of trumpetings, which started our beast again, since it was more afraid of elephants than it was of water. In we went and were presently floundering among the loose stones at the bottom of the river, which was nowhere over 4 feet deep, with Jana splashing after us not more than 5 yards behind. I twisted myself round and fired at him with the rifle. Whether I hit him or no I could not say, but he stopped for a few seconds, perhaps because he remembered the effect of a similar explosion upon his eye, which gave us a trifling start. Then he came on again in his steam engine fashion. When we were about in the middle of the river the inevitable happened. The camel fell, pitching us over its head into the stream. Still clinging to the rifle, I picked myself up and began half to swim, half to wade towards the farther shore, catching hold of Hans with my free hand. In a moment Jana was on to that camel. He gored it with his tusks, he trampled it with his feet, he got it round the neck with his trunk, dragging nearly the whole bulk of it out of the water. Then he set to work to pound it down into the mud and stones at the bottom of the river with such a persistent thoroughness that he gave us time to reach the other bank and climb up a stout tree which grew there, a sloping, flat-topped kind of tree that was fortunately easy to ascend, at least for a man. Here we sat gasping, perhaps about 30 feet above the ground level, and waited. Presently Jana, having finished with the camel, followed us, and without any difficulty located us in that tree. He walked all round it, considering the situation. Then he wound his huge trunk around the bole of the tree and, putting out his strength, tried to pull it over. It was an anxious moment, but this particular child of the forest had not grown there for some hundreds of years, withstanding all the shocks of wind, weather and water, in order to be laid low by an elephant, however enormous. It shook a little, no more. Abandoning this attempt as futile, Jana began to try to dig it up by driving his tusk under the roots. Here he failed because they grew among stones, which evidently jarred him. Ceasing from these agricultural efforts with a deep rumble of rage, he adopted yet a third expedient. Rearing his huge bulk into the air, he brought down his forefeet with all the tremendous weight of his great body behind them onto the sloping trunk of the tree just below where the branches sprang, perhaps 12 or 13 feet above the ground. The shock was so heavy that for a moment I thought the tree would be uprooted or snapped in two. Thank heaven it held, but the vibration was such that Hans and I were nearly shaken out of the upper branches, like autumn apples from a bough. Indeed, I think I should have gone had not the monkey-like Hans, who had toes to cling with as well as fingers, gripped me by the collar. Thrice did Jana repeat this manoeuvre. At the third onslaught I saw to my horror that the roots were loosening. I heard some of them snap, and a crack appeared in the ground not far from the bole. Fortunately Jana never noted these symptoms, for abandoning a plan which he considered unavailing, he stood for a while swaying his trunk and lost in gentle thought. "Hans," I whispered, "load the rifle, quick. I can get him in the spine or the other eye." "Wet powder won't go off, Baas," groaned Hans. "The water got to it in the river." "No," I answered,
and it is all your fault for making me shoot at him when I could take no aim." "It would have been just the same, Baas, for the rifle went under water also when we fell from the camel, and the cap would have been damp and perhaps the powder too. Also the shot made Jana stop for a moment." This was true, but it was maddening to be obliged to sit there with an empty gun, when if I had but one charge, or even my pistol, I was sure that I could have blinded or crippled this satanic pachyderm. A few minutes later Jana played his last card. Coming quite close to the trunk of the tree, he reared himself up as before, but this time stretched out his forelegs so that these and his body were supported on the broad bole. Then he elongated his trunk and with it began to break off boughs which grew between us and him. "I don't think he can reach us," I said doubtfully to Hans. "That is, unless he brings a stone to stand on." "Oh, Baas, pray be silent," answered Hans, "or he will understand and fetch one." Though the idea seemed absurd, on the whole I thought it well to take the hint, for who knew how much this experienced beast did or did not understand. Then, as we could go no higher, we wriggled as far as we dared along our boughs and waited. Presently Jana, having finished his clearing operations, began to lengthen his trunk to its full measure. Literally it seemed to expand like a telescope or india rubber ring. Out it came, foot after foot, till its snapping tip was waving within a few inches of us, just short of my foot and Hans's head, or rather felt hat. One final stretch and he reached the hat, which he removed with a flourish and thrust it into the red cavern of his mouth. As it appeared no more, I suppose he ate it. This loss of his hat moved Hans to fury. Hurling horrible curses at Jana, he drew his butcher's knife and made ready. Once more the sinuous brown trunk elongated itself. Evidently Jana had got a better hold with his hind legs this time, or perhaps he had actually wriggled himself a few inches up the tree. At any rate I saw to my dismay that there was every prospect of my making a second acquaintance with that snapping tip. The end of the trunk was lying along my bough like a huge brown snake and creeping up, up, up. "He'll get us," I muttered. Hans said nothing but leaned forward a little, holding on with his left hand. Next instant, in the light of the rising sun, I saw a knife flash, saw also that the point of it had been driven through the lower lip of Jana's trunk, pinning it to the bough like a butterfly to a board. My word, what a commotion ensued! Up the trunk came a scream which nearly blew me away. Then Jana, with a wriggling motion, tried to unnail himself as gently as possible, for it was clear that the knife point hurt him, but could not do so because Hans still held the handle and had driven the blade deep into the wood. Lastly he dragged himself downwards with such energy that something had to go, that something being the skin and muscle of the lower lip, which was cut clean through, leaving the knife erect in the bough. Over he went backwards, a most imperial cropper. Then he picked himself up, thrust the tip of his trunk into his mouth, sucked it as one does a cut finger, and finally, roaring in defeated rage, fled into the river, which he waded, back upon his tracks towards his own home. Yes, off he went, Hans screaming curses and demands that he should restore his hat to him, and very seldom in all my life have I seen a sight that I thought more beautiful than that of his whisking tail. "Now, Baas," chuckled Hans, "the old devil has got a sore nose as well as a sore eye by which to remember us. But, Baas, I think we had better be going before he has time to think and comes back with a long stick to knock us out of this tree." So we went, in double quick time I can assure you, or at any rate as fast as my stiff limbs and general condition would allow. Fortunately we had now no doubt as to our direction, since standing up through the mists of dawn with sunbeams resting on its forest-clad crest, we could clearly see the strange tumulus-shaped hill which the white Kender called the Holy Mount, the home of the Child. It appeared to be about 20 miles away, but in reality was a good deal farther, for when we had walked for several hours it seemed almost as distant as ever. In truth, that was a dreadful trudge. Not only was I exhausted with all the terrors I had passed and our long midnight flight, but the wound where Jana had pinched out a portion of my frame, inflamed by the riding, had now grown stiff and intolerably sore.
so that every step gave me pain which sometimes culminated in agony. Moreover, it was no use giving in, foodless as we were, for Marût had carried the provisions and with the chance of Jana returning to look us up. So I stuck to it and said nothing. For the first 10 miles the country seemed uninhabited. Doubtless it was too near to the borders of the Black Kendah to be popular as a place of residence. After this we saw herds of cattle and a few camels, apparently untended. Perhaps their guards were hidden away in the long grass. Then we came to some fields of mealies that were, I noticed, quite untouched by the hailstorm, which it would seem had confined its attentions to the land of the Black Kendah. Of these we ate thankfully enough. A little farther on we perceived huts perched on an inaccessible place in a kloof. Also their inhabitants perceived us, for they ran away as though in a great fright. Still we did not try to approach the huts, not knowing how we should be received. After my sojourn in Simba town I had become possessed of a love of life in the open. For another 2 hours I limped forward with pain and grief. By now I was leaning on Hans's shoulder, up an endless uncultivated rise clothed with euphorbias and fern-like cycads. At length we reached its top and found ourselves within a rifle shot of a fenced native village. I suppose that its inhabitants had been warned of our coming by runners from the huts I have mentioned. At any rate, the moment we appeared the men, to the number of 30 or more, poured out of the south gate armed with spears and other weapons and proceeded to ring us round and behave in a very threatening manner. I noticed at once that, although most of them were comparatively light in colour, some of these men partook of the negroid characteristics of the Black Kendah from whom we had escaped, to such an extent indeed that this blood was clearly predominant in them. Still, it was also clear that they were deadly foes of this people, for when I shouted out to them that we were friends of Harût and those who worshipped the Child, they yelled back that we were liars. No friend of the Child, they said, came from the country of the Black Kendah who worshipped the devil Jana. I tried to explain that least of all men in the world did we worship Jana, who had been hunting us for hours, but they would not listen. "You are spies of Simba's. The smell of Jana is upon you." This may have been true enough, they yelled, adding, "We will kill you, white-faced goat. We will kill you, little yellow monkey, for none who are not enemies come here from the land of the Black Kendah." "Kill us then," I answered, "and bring the curse of the Child upon you. Bring famine, bring hail, bring war." These words were, I think, well chosen. At any rate, they induced a pause in their murderous intentions. For a while they hesitated, all talking together at once. At last the advocates of violence appeared to get the upper hand, and once more a number of men began to dance about us, waving their spears and crying out that we must die who came from the Black Kendah. I sat down upon the ground, for I was so exhausted that at the time I did not greatly care whether I died or lived, while Hans drew his knife and stood over me, cursing them as he had cursed at Jana. By slow degrees they drew nearer and nearer. I watched them with a kind of idle curiosity, believing that the moment when they came within actual spear thrust would be our last, but, as I have said, not greatly caring because of my mental and physical exhaustion. I had already closed my eyes that I might not see the flash of the falling steel, when an exclamation from Hans caused me to open them again. Following the line of the knife with which he pointed, I perceived a troop of men on camels emerging from the gates of the village at full speed. In front of these, his white garments fluttering on the wind, rode a bearded and dignified person in whom I recognized Harût, Harût himself, waving a spear and shouting as he came. Our assailants heard and saw him also, then flung down their weapons as though in dismay, either at his appearance or his words, which I could not catch. Harût guided his rushing camel straight at the man who I presumed was their leader, and struck at him with his spear as though in fury, wounding him in the shoulder and causing him to fall to the ground. As he struck he called out, "Dog, would you harm the guests of the Child?" Then I heard no more because I fainted away. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of the Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. This slip of Vox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Dweller in the Cave. After this it seemed to me that I dreamed a long and very troubled dream concerning all sorts of curious things which I cannot remember. At last I opened my eyes and observed that I lay on a low bed raised about 3 inches above the floor, in an eastern-looking room, large and cool. It had window places in it, but no windows, only grass mats hung upon a rod which, I noted inconsequently, worked on a rough wooden hinge, or rather pin, that enabled the curtain to be turned back against the wall. Through one of these window places I saw at a little distance the slope of the forest-covered hill, which reminded me of something to do with a child. For the life of me I could not remember what. As I lay wondering over the matter, I heard a shuffling step which I recognized, and turning saw Hans twiddling a new hat made of straw in his fingers. "Hans," I said, "where did you get that new hat?" "They gave it me here, Baas," he answered. "The Baas will remember that the devil Jana ate the other." Then I did remember more or less, while Hans continued to twiddle the hat. I begged him to put it on his head because it fidgeted me, and then inquired where we were. "In the town of the Child, Baas, where they carried you after you had seemed to die down yonder. A very nice town where there is plenty to eat, though having been asleep for 3 days you have had nothing except a little milk and soup, which was poured down your throat with a spoon whenever you seemed to half wake for a while. I was tired and wanted a long rest, Hans, and now I feel hungry. Tell me, are the Lord and Bena here also, or were they killed after all?" "Yes, Baas, they are safe enough, and so are all our goods. They were both with Harût when he saved us down by the village yonder, but you went to sleep and did not see them. They have been nursing you ever since, Baas." Just then Savage himself entered, carrying some soup upon a wooden tray and looking almost as smart as he used to do at Ragnall Castle. "Good day, sir," he said in his best professional manner. "Very glad to see you back with us, sir, and getting well, I trust, especially after we had given you and Mr. Hans up as dead." I thanked him and drank the soup, asking him to cook me something more substantial as I was starving, which he departed to do. Then I sent Hans to find Lord Ragnall, who, it appeared, was out walking in the town. No sooner had they gone than Harût entered looking more dignified than ever, and bowing gravely seated himself upon the mat in the Eastern fashion. "Some strong spirit must go with you, Lord Macumazana," he said, "that you should live today after we were sure that you had been slain." "That's where you made a mistake. Your magic was not of much service to you there, friend Harût." "Yet my magic, as you call it, though I have none, was of some service after all, Macumazana, as it chanced I had no opportunity of breathing in the wisdom of the Child for 2 days from the hour of our arrival here, because I was hurt on the knee in the fight and so weary that I could not travel up the mountain and seek light from the eyes of the Child. On the 3rd day, however, I went and the Oracle told me all. Then I descended swiftly, gathered men and reached those fools in time to keep you from harm. They have paid for what they did, Lord." "I am sorry, Harût, for they knew no better, and Harût, though I saved myself, or rather Hans saved me, we have left your brother behind, and with him the others." "I know. Jana was too strong for them. You and your servant alone could prevail against him." "Not so, Harût. He prevailed against us. All we could do was injure his eye and the tip of his trunk and escape from him." "Which is more than any others have done for many generations, Lord. But doubtless as the beginning was, so shall the end be. Jana, I think, is near his death, and through you." "I don't know," I repeated. "Who and what is Jana?" "Have I not told you that he is an evil spirit who inhabits the body of a huge elephant?" "Yes, and so did Marût, but I think that he is just a huge elephant with a very bad temper of his own. Still, whatever he is, he will take some killing, and I don't want to meet him again by that horrible lake." "Then you will meet him elsewhere, Lord. For if you do not go to look for Jana, Jana will come to look for you, who have hurt him so sorely. Remember that henceforth, wherever you go in this land, it may happen that you will meet Jana." "Do you mean to say that the brute comes into the territory of the White Kendah?" "Yes, Macumazana,
At times he comes, or a spirit wearing his shape comes, I know not which. What I do know is that twice in my life I myself have seen him upon the Holy Mount, though how he came or how he went, none can tell." "Why was he wandering there, Harût?" "Who can say, Lord? Tell me why evil wanders through the world and I will answer your question. Only I repeat, let those who have harmed Jana beware of Jana." "And let Jana beware of me if I can meet him with a decent gun in my hand, for I have a score to settle with that beast. Now, Harût, here is another matter. Just before he was killed, Marût, your brother, began to tell me something about the wife of the Lord Ragnall. I had no time to listen to the end of his words, though I thought he said she was upon yonder holy mount. Did I hear aright?" Instantly Harût's face became like that of a stone idol, impenetrable, impassive. "Either you misunderstand, Lord," he answered, "or my brother raved in his fear. Wherever she may be, that beautiful lady is not upon the Holy Mount, unless there is another Holy Mount in the land of death. Moreover, Lord, as we were speaking of this matter, let me tell you the forest upon that mount must be trodden by none save the priest of the Child. If others set foot there, they die, for it is watched by a guardian more terrible even than Jana, nor is he the Holy One. Ask me nothing of that guardian, for I will not answer, and above all, if you or your comrades value life, let them not seek to look upon him." Understanding that it was quite useless to pursue this subject farther at the moment, I turned to another, remarking that the hailstorm which had smitten the country of the Black Kendah was the worst that I had ever experienced. "Yes," answered Harût, "so I have learned. That was the first of the curses which the Child, through my mouth, promised to Simba and his people if they molested us upon our road. The second, you will remember, was famine, which for them is near at hand, seeing that they have little corn in store and none left to gather, and that most of their cattle are dead of the hail. If they have no corn while, as I noted, you have plenty which the storm spared, will not they, who are many in number and near to starving, attack you and take your corn, Harût?" "Certainly they will do so, Lord, and then will fall the third curse, the curse of war. All this was foreseen long ago, Macumazana, and you are here to help us in that war. Among your goods you have many guns and much powder and lead. You shall teach our people how to use those guns, that with them we may destroy the Black Kendah." "I think not," I replied quietly. "I came here to kill a certain elephant and to receive payment for my service in ivory, not to fight the Black Kendah, of whom I have already seen enough. Moreover, the guns are not my property but that of Lord Ragnall, who perhaps will ask his own price for the use of them." "And the Lord Ragnall, who came here against our will, is, as it chances, our property, and we may ask your own price for his life. Now, farewell for a while, since you who are still sick and weak have talked enough. Only before I go, as your friend and that of those with you, I will add one word. If you would continue to look upon the sun, let none of you try to set foot in the forest upon the Holy Mount. Wander where you will upon its southern slopes, but strive not to pass the wall of rock which rings the forest round." Then he rose, bowed gravely and departed, leaving me full of reflections. Shortly afterwards Savage and Hans returned, bringing me some meat which the former had cooked in an admirable fashion. I ate of it heartily, and just as they were carrying off the remains of the meal, Ragnall himself arrived. Our greeting was very warm, as might be expected in the case of two comrades who never thought to speak to each other again on this side of the grave. As I had supposed, he was certain that Hans and I had been cut off and killed by the Black Kendah, as, after we were missed, some of the camelmen asserted that they had actually seen us fall. So he went on, or rather was carried on by the rush of the camels, grieving, since, it being impossible to attempt to recover our bodies or even to return, that was the only thing to do, and in due course reached the town of the Child without further accident. Here they rested and mourned us,
till some days later Harût suddenly announced that we still lived, though how he knew this they could not ascertain. Then they sallied out and found us, as has been told, in great danger from the ignorant villagers who, until we appeared, had not even heard of our existence. I asked what they had done and what information they had obtained since their arrival at this place. His answer was, nothing and none worth mentioning. The town appeared to be a small one of not much over 2,000 inhabitants, all of whom were engaged in agricultural pursuits and in camel breeding. The herds of camels, however, they gathered, for the most part were kept at outlying settlements on the farther side of the cone-shaped mountain. As they were unable to talk the language, the only person from whom they could gain knowledge was Harût, who spoke to them in his broken English and told them much what he had told me, namely that the upper mountain was a sacred place that might only be visited by the priests, since any uninitiated person who set foot there came to a bad end. They had not seen any of these priests in the town, where no form of worship appeared to be practised, but they had observed men driving small numbers of sheep or goats up the flanks of the mountain towards the forest. Of what went on upon this mountain and who lived there they remained in complete ignorance. It was a case of stalemate. Harût would not tell them anything, nor could they learn anything for themselves. He added in a depressed way that the whole business seemed very hopeless, and that he had begun to doubt whether there was any tidings of his lost wife to be gained among the Kender, white or black. Now I repeated to him Marût's dying words, of which most unhappily I had never heard the end. These seemed to give him new life, since they showed that tidings there was of some sort, if only it could be extracted. But how might this be done? How? How? For a whole week things went on thus. During this time I recovered my strength completely, except in one particular which reduced me to helplessness. The place on my thigh where Jana had pinched out a bit of skin healed up well enough, but the inflammation struck inwards to the nerve of my left leg, where once I had been injured by a lion, with the result that whenever I tried to move I was tortured by pains of a sciatic nature. So I was obliged to lie still and to content myself with being carried on the bed into a little garden which surrounded the mud-built and whitewashed house that had been allotted to us as a dwelling place. There I lay hour after hour, staring at the holy mount which began to spring from the plain within a few hundred yards of the scattered township. For a mile or so its slopes were bare except for grass on which sheep and goats were grazed, and a few scattered trees. Studying the place through glasses, I observed that these slopes were crowned by a vertical precipice of what looked like lava rock, which seemed to surround the whole mountain and must have been quite 100 feet high. Beyond this precipice, which to all appearances was of an unclimbable nature, began a dense forest of large trees, cedars I thought, clothing it to the very top. This is so far as I could see. One day when I was considering the place, Harût entered the garden suddenly and caught me in the act. "The house of the god is beautiful," he said, "is it not?" "Very," I answered, "and of a strange formation. But how do those who dwell on it climb that precipice?" "It cannot be climbed," he answered, "but there is a road which I am about to travel who go to worship the Child. Yet I have told you, Macumazana, that any strangers who seek to walk that road find death. If they do not believe me, let them try," he added meaningly. Then, after many inquiries about my health, he informed me that news had reached him to the effect that the Black Kendah were mad at the loss of their crops, which the hail had destroyed, and because of the near prospect of starvation. "Then soon they will be wishing to reap yours with spears," I said. "That is so. Therefore, my lord Macumazana, get well quickly that you may be able to scare away these crows with guns, for in 14 days the harvest should begin upon our uplands. Farewell, and have no fears, for during my absence my people will feed and watch you, and on the 3rd night I shall return again." After Harût's departure a deep depression fell upon all of us. Even Hans was depressed, while Savage became like a man under sentence of execution at a near but uncertain date. I tried to cheer him up and asked him what was the matter. "I don't know, Mr. Quatermain," he answered, "but the fact is, this is an 'ateful and unholy 'ole." In his agitation he quite lost the grip of his H's, which was always weak. "And I am sure that it is the last I shall ever see, except one." "Well, Savage," I said jokingly, "at any rate there don't seem to be any snakes here." "No, Mr. Quatermain, that is, I haven't met any, but they crawl about me all night, and whenever I see that prophet man he talks of them to me. Yes, he talks of them and nothing else, with a sort of cold look in his eyes that makes my back creep. I wish it was over, I do, who shall never see old England again." And he went away, I think to hide his very painful and evident emotion. That evening Hans returned from an expedition on which I had sent him with instructions to try to get round the mountain and report what was on the other side. It had been a complete failure, as after he had gone a few miles men appeared who ordered him back. They were so threatening in their demeanour that had it not been for the little rifle Intombi which he carried under pretence of shooting buck, a weapon that they regarded with great awe, they would, he thought, have killed him. He added that he had been quite unsuccessful in his efforts to collect any news of value from man, woman or child, all of whom, although very polite, appeared to have orders to tell him nothing, concluding with the remark that he considered the white Kender bigger devils than the black Kender, inasmuch as they were more clever. Shortly after this abortive attempt we debated our position with earnestness and came to a certain conclusion of which I will speak in its place. If I remember right, it was on this same night of our debate, after Harût's return from the mountain, that the first incident of interest happened. There were two rooms in our house, divided by a partition which ran almost up to the roof. In the left-hand room slept Ragnall and Savage, and in that to the right Hans and I. Just at the breaking of dawn I was awakened by hearing some agitated conversation between Savage and his master. A minute later they both entered my sleeping place, and I saw in the faint light that Ragnall looked very disturbed and Savage very frightened. "What's the matter?" I asked. "We have seen my wife," answered Ragnall. I stared at him and he went on. "Savage woke me by saying that there was someone in the room. I sat up and looked, and as I live, Quatermain, standing gazing at me in such a position that the light of dawn from the window place fell upon her, was my wife." "How was she dressed?" I asked at once. "In a kind of white robe cut rather low, with her hair loose hanging to her waist, but carefully combed and held outspread by what appeared to be a bent piece of ivory about 1.5 feet long, to which it was fastened by a thread of gold." "Is that all?" "No. Upon her breast was that necklace of red stones with the little image hanging from its centre, which those rascals gave her and she always wore." "Anything more?" "Yes. In her arms she carried what looked like a veiled child. It was so still that I think it must have been dead." "Well, what happened?" "I was so overcome I could not speak, and she stood gazing at me with wide opened eyes, looking more beautiful than I can tell you. She never stirred and her lips never moved, that I will swear, and yet both of us heard her say, very low but quite clearly, 'The mountain, George. Don't desert me. Seek me on the mountain, my dear, my husband.'" "Well, what next?" "I sprang up and she was gone. That's all. Now tell me what you saw and heard, Savage." "What his lordship saw and heard, Mr. Quatermain, neither more nor less, except that I was awake, having had one of my bad dreams about snakes, and saw her come through the door." "Through the door? Was it open then?" "No, sir, it was shut and bolted. She just came through it as if it wasn't there. Then I called to his lordship after she had been looking at him for full half a minute or so, for I couldn't speak at first. There's one more thing, or rather two. On her head was a little cap that looked as though it had been made from the skin of a bird, with a gold snake rising up in front, which snake was the first thing I caught sight of, as of course it would be, sir. Also the dress she wore was so thin that through it I could see her shape and the sandals on her feet, which were fastened at the instep with studs of gold." "I saw no feather cap or snake," said Ragnall. "Then that's the oddest part of the whole business," I remarked. "Go back to your room, both of you, and if you see anything more, call me. I want to think things over." They went in a bewildered sort of fashion, and I called Hans and spoke with him in a whisper, repeating to him the little that he had not understood of our talk, for as I have said, although he never spoke it, Hans knew a great deal of English. "Now, Hans," I said to him, "what is the use of you? You are no better than a fraud. You pretend to be the best watchdog in Africa, and yet a woman comes into this house under your nose and in the grey of the morning, and you do not see her. Where is your reputation, Hans?" The old fellow grew almost speechless with indignation. Then he spluttered his answer. "It is not a woman, Baas, but a spook. Who am I that I should be expected to catch spooks as though they were thieves or rats? As it happens, I was wide awake half an hour before the dawn and lay with my eyes fixed upon that door, which I bolted myself last night. It never opened, Baas. Moreover, since this talk began I have been to look at it. During the night a spider has made its web from doorpost to doorpost, and that web is unbroken. If you do not believe me, come and see for yourself. Yet they say the woman came through the doorway and therefore through the spider's web. Oh, Baas, what is the use of wasting thought upon the ways of spooks which, like the wind, come and go as they will, especially in this haunted land from which, as we have all agreed, we should do well to get away?" I went and examined the door for myself, for by now my sciatica, or whatever it may have been, was so much better that I could walk a little. What Hans said was true. There was the spider's web with the spider sitting in the middle. Also some of the threads of the web were fixed from post to post, so that it was impossible that the door could have been opened, or, if opened, that anyone could have passed through the doorway without breaking them. Therefore, unless the woman came through one of the little window places, which was almost incredible as they were high above the ground, or dropped from the smoke hole in the roof, or had been shut into the place when the door was closed the previous night, I could not see how she had arrived there. If any one of these incredible suppositions was correct, then how did she get out again with two men watching her? There were only two solutions to the problem, namely that the whole occurrence was hallucination, or that, in fact, Ragnall and Savage had seen something unnatural and uncanny. If the latter were correct, I only wished that I had shared the experience, as I have always longed to see a ghost. A real indisputable ghost would be a great support to our doubting minds, that is, if we knew its owner to be dead. But this was another thought. If by any chance Lady Ragnall were still alive and a prisoner upon that mountain, what they had seen was no ghost, but a shadow or simulacrum of a living person projected consciously or unconsciously by that person for some unknown purpose. What could the purpose be? As it chanced, the answer was not difficult, and to it the words she was reported to have uttered gave a cue. Only a few hours ago, just before we turned in indeed, as I have said, we had been discussing matters. What I have not said is that in the end we arrived at the conclusion that our quest here was wild and useless, and that we should do well to try to escape from the place before we became involved in a war of extermination between two branches of an obscure tribe, one of which was quiet and the other semi-savage. Indeed, although Ragnall still hung back a little, it had been arranged that I should try to purchase camels in exchange for guns, unless I could get them for nothing, which might be less suspicious, and that we should attempt such an escape under cover of an expedition to kill the elephant Jana. Supposing such a vision to be possible, then might it not have come or been sent to deter us from this plan? It would seem so. Thus reflecting, I went to sleep, worn out with useless wonderment, and did not wake again till breakfast time. That morning, when we were alone together, Ragnall said to me: "I have been thinking over what happened, or seemed to happen last night, and I am not at all a superstitious man or one given to vain imaginings, but I am sure that Savage and I really did see and hear the spirit or the shadow of my wife. Her body it could not have been, as you will admit, though how she could utter or seem to utter audible speech without one is more than I can tell. Also I am sure that she is captive upon yonder mountain and came to call me to rescue her. Under these circumstances I feel that it is my duty as well as my desire to give up any idea of leaving the country and try to find out the truth." "And how will you do that?" I asked, "seeing that no one will tell us anything." "By going to see for myself." "It is impossible, Ragnall. I am too lame at present to walk half a mile, much less to climb precipices." "I know, and that is one of the reasons why I did not suggest that you should accompany me. The other is that there is no object in all of us risking our lives. I wish to face the thing alone, but that good fellow Savage says that he will go where I go, leaving you and Hans here to make further attempts if we do not return. Our plan is to slip out of the town during the night, wearing white dresses like the Kender, of which I have bought some for tobacco, and make the best of our way up the slope by starlight that is very bright now. When dawn comes we will try to find the road through that precipice or over it, and for the rest trust to Providence." Dismayed at this intelligence, I did all I could to dissuade him from such a mad venture, but quite without avail, for never did I know a more determined or more fearless man than Lord Ragnall. He had made up his mind and there was an end of the matter. Afterwards I talked with Savage, pointing out to him all the perils involved in the attempt, but likewise without avail. He was more depressed than usual, apparently on the ground that, having seen the ghost of her ladyship, he was quite sure that he had not long to live. Still he declared that where his master went he would go, as he preferred to die with him rather than alone. So I was obliged to give in and with a melancholy heart to do what I could to help the simple preparations for this crazy undertaking, realizing all the while that the only real help must come from above, since in such a case man was powerless. I should add that after consultation Ragnall gave up the idea of adopting a Kender disguise, which was certain to be discovered, also of starting at night when the town was guarded. That very afternoon they went, going out of the town quite openly on the pretext of shooting partridges and small buck on the lower slopes of the mountain, where both were numerous, as Harût had informed us we were quite at liberty to do. The farewell was somewhat sad, especially with Savage, who gave me a letter he had written for his old mother in England, requesting me to post it if ever again I came to a civilized land. I did my best to put a better spirit in him, but without avail. He only wrung my hand warmly, said that it was a pleasure to have known such a real gentleman as myself, and expressed a hope that I might get out of this hell and live to a green old age amongst Christians. Then he wiped away a tear with the cuff of his coat, touched his hat in the orthodox fashion and departed. Their outfit, I should add, was very simple: some food in bags, a flask of spirits, 2 double-barrelled guns that would shoot either shot or ball, a bull's-eye lantern, matches and their pistols. Hans walked with them a little way and, leaving them outside the town, returned. "Why do you look so gloomy, Hans?" I asked. "Because, Baas," he answered, twiddling his hat, "I had grown to be fond of the white man Bena, who was always very kind to me and did not treat me like dirt as low-born whites are apt to do. Also he cooked well, and now I shall have to do that work which I do not like." "What do you mean, Hans? The man isn't dead, is he?" "No, Baas, but soon he will be, for the shadow of death is in his eyes." "Then how about Lord Ragnall?" "I saw no shadow in his eyes. I think that he will live, Baas." I tried to get some explanation of these dark sayings out of the Hottentot, but he would add nothing to his words. All the following night I lay awake filled with heavy fears, which deepened as the hours went on. Just before dawn we heard a knocking on our door and Ragnall's voice whispering to us to open. Hans did so while I lit a candle, of which we had a good supply. As it burned up Ragnall entered, and from his face I saw at once that something terrible had happened. He went to the jar where we kept our water and drank 3 pannikinfuls, one after the other. Then, without waiting to be asked, he said, "Savage is dead," and paused a while as though some awful recollection overcame him. "Listen," he went on presently. "We worked up the hillside without firing, although we saw plenty of partridges and one buck, till just as twilight was closing in we came to the cliff face. Here we perceived a track that ran to the mouth of a narrow cave or tunnel in the lava rock of the precipice, which looked quite unclimbable. While we were wondering what to do, 8 or 10 white-robed men appeared out of the shadows and seized us before we could make any resistance. After talking together for a little, they took away our guns and pistols, with which some of them disappeared. Then their leader, with many bows, indicated that we were at liberty to proceed by pointing first to the mouth of the cave and next to the top of the precipice, saying something like Ingani, which I believe means a little child, does it not? I nodded and he went on. After this they all departed down the hill, smiling in a fashion that disturbed me. We stood for a while irresolute, until it became dark. I asked Savage what he thought we had better do, expecting that he would say return to the town. To my surprise he answered, "Go on, of course, my lord. Don't let these brutes say that we white men daren't walk a step without our guns. Indeed, in any case I mean to go on, even if your lordship won't." Whilst he spoke he took a bull's-eye lantern from his food bag, which had not been interfered with by the Kender, and lit it. I stared at him amazed, for the man seemed to be animated by some tremendous purpose, or rather it was as though a force from without had got hold of his will and were pushing him to an unknown end. Indeed, his next words showed that this was so, for he exclaimed, "There is something drawing me into that cave, my lord. It may be death, I think it is death, but whatever it be, go I must. Perhaps you would do well to stop outside till I have seen." I stepped forward to catch hold of the man, who I thought had gone mad, as perhaps was the case. Before I could lay my hands on him he had run rapidly to the mouth of the cave. Of course I followed, but when I reached its entrance the star of light thrown forward by the bull's-eye lantern showed me that he was already about 8 yards down the tunnel. Then I heard a terrible hissing noise and Savage exclaiming, "Oh my God!" twice over. As he spoke the lantern fell from his hand but did not go out, because as you know it is made to burn in any position. I leapt forward and picked it from the ground, and while I was doing so became aware that Savage was running still further into the depths of the cave. I lifted the lantern above my head and looked. This is what I saw. About 10 paces from me was Savage with his arms outstretched and dancing, yes, dancing, first to the right and then to the left with a kind of horrible grace and to the tune of a hideous hissing music. I held the lantern higher and perceived that beyond him, lifted 8 or 9 feet into the air, nearly to the roof of the tunnel in fact, was the head of the hugest snake of which I had ever heard. It was as broad as the bottom of a wheelbarrow. Were it cut off I think it would quite fill a large wheelbarrow, while the head upon which it was supported was quite as thick as my middle, and the undulating body beneath it, which stretched far away into the darkness, was the size of an 18-gallon cask, and glittered green and grey, lined and splashed with silver and with gold. It hissed and swayed its great head to the right, holding Savage with cold eyes that yet seemed to be on fire, whereon he danced to the right. It hissed again and swayed its head to the left, whereon he danced to the left. Then suddenly it reared its head right to the top of the cave and so remained for a few seconds, whereon Savage stood still, bending a little forward, as though he were bowing to the reptile. Next instant like a flash it struck, for I saw its white fangs bury themselves in the back of Savage, who with a kind of sigh fell forward onto his face. Then there was a convulsion of those shining folds, followed by a sound as of bones being ground up in a steam-driven mortar. I staggered against the wall of the cave and shut my eyes for a moment, for I felt faint. When I opened them again it was to see something flat, misshapen, elongated like a reflection in a spoon, something that had been Savage lying on the floor, and stretched over it the huge serpent studying me with its steely eyes. Then I ran, I am not ashamed to say I ran out of that horrible hole and far into the night. "Small blame to you," I said, adding, "Hans, get me some square face, neat," for I felt as queer as though I had been in that cave with its guardian. "There is very little more to tell," went on Ragnall after I had drunk the Hollands. "I lost my way on the mountain side and wandered for many hours, until at last I blundered up against one of the outermost houses of the town, after which things were easy. Perhaps I should add that wherever I went on my way down the mountain, it seemed to me that I heard people laughing at me in an unnatural kind of voice. That's all." After this we sat silent for a long time, till at length Hans said in his unmoved tone: "The light has come, Baas. Shall I blow out the candle, which it is a pity to waste? Also, does the Baas wish me to cook the breakfast, now that the snake devil is making his off Bena, as I hope to make mine off him before all is done? Snakes are very good to eat, Baas, if you know how to dress them in the Hottentot way." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Hans Steals the Keys. A few hours later some of the white Kender arrived at the house and very politely delivered to us Ragnall's and poor Savage's guns and pistols, which they said they had found lying in the grass on the mountain side, and with them the bull's eye lantern that Ragnall had thrown away in his flight. All of which articles I accepted without comment. That evening also Harût called and, after salutations, asked where Bena was as he did not see him. Then my indignation broke out. "O white-bearded father of liars," I said, "you know well that he is in the belly of the serpent which lives in the cave of the mountain." "What, Lord?" exclaimed Harût, addressing Ragnall in his peculiar English. "Have you been for walk up to Hole in Hill? Suppose Bena want see big snake. He always very fond of snake, you know, and they very fond of him. You 'member how they come out of his pocket in your house in England? Well, he know all about snake now." "You villain!" exclaimed Ragnall. "You murderer! I have a mind to kill you where you are." "Why you choke me, Lord, because snake choke your man? Poor snake, he only want dinner. If you go where lion live, lion kill you. If you go where snake live, snake kill you. I tell you not to, you take no notice. Now I tell you all, go if you wish. No one stop you. Perhaps you kill snake, who knows? Only you take no gun there, please. That not allowed. When you tired of this town, go see snake. Only 'member that not right way to House of Child. There another way which you never find." "Look here," said Ragnall, "what is the use of all this foolery? You know very well why we are in your devilish country. It is because I believe you have stolen my wife to make her the priestess of your evil religion, whatever it may be, and I want her back." "All this great mistake," replied Harût blandly. "We no steal beautiful lady you marry because we find she not right priestess. Also Macumazana here not to look for lady but to kill elephant Jana and get pay in ivory like good businessman. You, Lord, come with him as friend, though we no ask you, that all. Then you try find temple of our God and snake which watch door kill your servant. Why we not kill you, eh?" "Because you are afraid to," answered Ragnall boldly. "Kill me if you can and take the consequences. I am ready." Harût studied him not without admiration. "You very brave man," he said, "and we no wish kill you and perhaps after all everything come right in end. Only Child know about that. Also you help us fight Black Kendah by and by. So Lord, you quite safe unless you big fool and go call on snake in cave. He very hungry snake and soon want more dinner. You hear, light in darkness, Lord of Fire," he added, suddenly turning on Hans, who was squatted nearby twiddling his hat with a face that for absolute impassiveness resembled a deal board. "You hear he very hungry snake, you make nice tea for him." Hans rolled his little yellow eyes without even turning his head until they rested on the stately countenance of Harût, and answered in Bantu: "I hear, liar of the white beard, but what have I to do with this matter? Jana is my enemy who would have killed Macumazana my master, not your dirty snake. What is the good of this snake of yours? If it were any good, why does it not kill Jana whom you hate?
If it is no good, why do you not take a stick and knock it on the head? If you are afraid I will do so for you if you pay me. That for your snake," and very energetically he spat upon the floor. "All right," said Harût, still speaking in English. "You go kill snake. Go when you like, no one say no. Then we give you new name. Then we call you Lord of the Snake." As Hans, who was now engaged in lighting his corncob pipe, did not deign to answer these remarks, Harût turned to me and said: "Lord Macumazana, your leg still bad, eh? Well, I bring you some ointment what make it quite well. It holy ointment come from the Child. We want you get well quick." Then suddenly he broke into Bantu. "My lord, war draws near. The Black Kendah are gathering all their strength to attack us, and we must have your aid. I go down to the river Tava to see to certain matters as to the reaping of the outlying crops and other things. Within a week I will be back, then we must talk again, for by that time if you will use the ointment that I have given you, you will be as well as ever you were in your life. Rub it on your leg and mix a piece as large as a mealie grain in water and swallow it at night. It is not poison, see?" And taking the cover off a little earthenware pot which he produced, he scooped from it with his finger some of the contents, which looked like lard, put it on his tongue and swallowed it. Then he rose and departed with his usual bows. Here I may state that I used Harût's prescription with the most excellent results. That night I took a dose in water, very nasty it was, and rubbed my leg with the stuff, to find that next morning all pain had left me and that, except for some local weakness, I was practically quite well. I kept the rest of the salve for years and it proved a perfect specific in cases of sciatica and rheumatism. Now, alas, it is all used and no recipe is available from which it can be made up again. The next few days passed uneventfully. As soon as I could walk I began to go about the town, which was nothing but a scattered village much resembling those to be seen on the eastern coasts of Africa. Nearly all the men seemed to be away, making preparations for the harvest, I suppose, and as the women shut themselves up in their houses after the Oriental fashion, though the few that I saw about were unveiled and rather good looking, I did not gather any intelligence worth noting. To tell the truth, I cannot remember being in a more uninteresting place than this little town with its extremely uncommunicative population which, it seemed to me, lived under a shadow of fear that prevented all gaiety. Even the children, of whom there were not many, crept about in a depressed fashion and talked in a low voice. I never saw any of them playing games or heard them shouting and laughing, as young people do in most parts of the world. For the rest, we were very well looked after. Plenty of food was provided for us and every thought taken for our comfort. Thus a strong and quiet pony was brought for me to ride because of my lameness. I had only to go out of the house and call and it arrived from somewhere, already saddled and bridled, in charge of a lad who appeared to be dumb. At any rate, when I spoke to him, he would not answer. Mounted on this pony I took one or two rides along the southern slopes of the mountain on the old pretext of shooting for the pot. Hans accompanied me on these occasions, but was, I noted, very silent and thoughtful, as though he were hunting something up and down his tortuous intelligence. Once we got quite near to the mouth of the cave or tunnel where poor Savage had met his horrid end. As we stood studying it, a white-robed man whose head was shaved, which made me think he must be a priest, came up and asked me mockingly why we did not go through the tunnel and see what lay beyond, adding, almost in the words of Harût himself, that none would attempt to interfere with us, as the road was open to any who could travel it. By way of answer I only smiled and put him a few questions about a very beautiful breed of goats with long silky hair, some of which he seemed to be engaged in herding. He replied that these goats were sacred, being the food of one who dwelt in the mountain who only ate when the moon changed. When I inquired who this person was, he said with his unpleasant smile that I had better go through the tunnel and see for myself, an invitation which I did not accept. That evening Harût appeared unexpectedly, looking very grave and troubled.
He was in a great hurry and only stayed long enough to congratulate me upon the excellent effects of his ointment, since no man could find Jana on one leg. I asked him when the fight with Jana was to come off. He replied, "Lord, I go up to the mountain to attend the feast of the first fruits, which is held at sunrise on the day of the new moon. After the offering the oracle will speak and we shall learn when there will be war with Jana and perchance other things." "May we not attend this feast, Harût, who are weary of doing nothing here?" "Certainly," he answered with his grave bow. "That is, if you come unarmed, for to appear before the Child with arms is death. You know the road. It runs through yonder cave and the forest beyond the cave. Take it when you will, Lord." "Then if we can pass the cave we shall be welcome at the feast? You will be very welcome. None shall hurt you there, going or returning. I swear it by the Child. O Macumazana," he added, smiling a little, "why do you talk folly, who know well that one lives in yonder cave whom none may look upon and love, as Bena learned not long ago? You are thinking that perhaps you might kill this dweller in the cave with your weapons. Put away that dream, seeing that henceforth those who watch you have orders to see that none of you leave this house carrying so much as a knife. Indeed, unless you promise me that this shall be so, you will not be suffered to set foot outside its garden until I return again. Now, do you promise?" I thought a while and, drawing the two others aside out of hearing, asked them their opinion. Ragnall was at first unwilling to give any such promise, but Hans said, "Baas, it is better to go free and unhurt without guns and knives than to become a prisoner once, as you were among the Black Kendah. Often there is but a short step between prison and the grave." Both Ragnall and I acknowledged the force of this argument, and in the end we gave the promise, speaking one by one. "It is enough," said Harût. "Moreover, know, Lord, that among us White Kendah he who breaks an oath is put across the river Tava unarmed, to make report thereof to Jana, father of lies. Now farewell. If we do not meet at the feast of the first fruits on the day of the new moon, whither once more I invite you, we can talk together here after I have heard the voice of the oracle." Then he mounted a camel which awaited him outside the gate and departed with an escort of 12 men, also riding camels. "There is some other road up that mountain, Quatermain," said Ragnall. "A camel could sooner pass through the eye of a needle than through that dreadful cave, even if it were empty." "Probably," I answered, "but as we don't know where it is and I dare say it lies miles from here, we need not trouble our heads on the matter. The cave is our only road, which means that there is no road." That evening at supper we discovered that Hans was missing, also that he had got possession of my keys and broken into a box containing liquor, for there it stood open in the cooking hut with the keys in the lock. "He has gone on the drink," I said to Ragnall, "and upon my soul I don't wonder at it. For sixpence I would follow his example." Then we went to bed. Next morning we breakfasted rather late, since when one has nothing to do there is no object in getting up early. As I was preparing to go to the cook house to boil some eggs, to our astonishment Hans appeared with a kettle of coffee. "Hans," I said, "you are a thief." "Yes, Baas," answered Hans. "You have been at the gin box and taking that poison." "Yes, Baas, I have been taking poison. Also I took a walk and all is right now. The Baas must not be angry, for it is very dull doing nothing here. Will the Baases eat porridge as well as eggs?" As it was no use scolding him, I said that we would. Moreover, there was something about his manner which made me suspicious, for really he did not look like a person who has just been very drunk. After we had finished breakfast he came and squatted down before me. Having lit his pipe he asked suddenly, "Would the Baases like to walk through that cave tonight? If so, there will be no trouble." "What do you mean?" I asked, suspecting that he was still drunk. "I mean, Baas, that the dweller in the cave is fast asleep." "How do you know that, Hans?" "Because I am the nurse who put him to sleep, Baas. Though he kicked and cried a great deal, he is asleep.
he will wake no more. Baas, I have killed the father of serpents." "Hans," I said, "now I am sure you are still drunk, although you do not show it outside." "Hans," asked Ragnall, to whom I had translated as much of this as he did not understand, "it is too early in the day to tell good stories. How could you possibly have killed that serpent without a gun, for you took none with you, or with it either for that matter?" "Will the Baases come and take a walk through the cave?" asked Hans with a snigger. "Not till I am quite sure that you are sober," I replied. Then remembering certain other events in this worthy's career, added, "Hans, if you do not tell us the story at once, I will beat you." "There isn't much story, Baas," replied Hans between long sucks at his pipe, which had nearly gone out, "because the thing was so easy. The Baas is very clever and so is the Lord Baas. Why then can they never see the stones that lie under their noses? It is because their eyes are always fixed upon the mountains between this world and the next. But the poor Hottentot, who looks at the ground to be sure that he does not stumble, he sees the stones. Now, Baas, did you not hear that man in a nightshirt with his head shaved say that those goats were food for one who dwelt in the mountain?" "I did. What of it, Hans?" "Who would be the one who dwelt in the mountain except the father of snakes in the cave, Baas? Ah, now for the first time you see the stone that lay at your feet all the while. And, Baas, did not the bald man add that this one in the mountain was only fed at new and full moon, and is not tomorrow the day of new moon, and therefore would he not be very hungry on the day before new moon, that is, last night?" "No doubt, Hans, but how can you kill a snake by feeding it?" "Oh, Baas, you may eat things that make you ill, and so can snake. Now you will guess the rest, so I had better go and wash the dishes." "Whether I guess or do not guess," I replied sagely, the latter being the right hypothesis, "the dishes can wait, Hans, since the lord there has not guessed. So continue." "Very well, Baas. In one of those boxes are some pounds of stuff which when mixed with water is used for preserving skins and skulls." "You mean the arsenic crystals," I said with a flash of inspiration. "I don't know what you call them, Baas. At first I thought they were hard sugar and stole some once when the real sugar was left behind to put into the coffee, without telling the Baas because it was my fault that the sugar was left behind." "Great heavens!" I ejaculated. "Then why aren't we all dead?" "Because at the last moment, Baas, I thought I would make sure, so I put some of the hard sugar into hot milk and, when it had melted, I gave it to that yellow dog which once bit me in the leg, the one that came from Beza Town, Baas, that I told you had run away. He was a very greedy dog, Baas, and drank up the milk at once. Then he gave a howl, twisted about, foamed at the mouth and died, and I buried him at once. After that I threw some more of the large sugar mixed with mealies to the fowls that we brought with us for cooking. 2 cocks and a hen swallowed them by mistake for the corn. Presently they fell on their backs, kicked a little and died. Some of the Mazitu, who were great thieves, stole those dead fowls, Baas. After this, Baas, I thought it best not to use that sugar in the coffee, and later on Bena told me that it was deadly poison. Well, Baas, it came into my mind that if I could make that great snake swallow enough of this poison, he too might die. So I stole your keys, as I often do, Baas, when I want anything, because you leave them lying about everywhere, and to deceive you first opened one of the boxes that are full of square face and brandy and left it open, for I wished you to think that I had just gone to get drunk like anybody else. Then I opened another box and got out 2 one-pound tins of the sugar which kills dogs and fowls. Half a pound of it I melted in the boiling water with some real sugar to make the stuff sweet, and put it into a bottle. The rest I tied with string in 12 little packets in the soft paper which is in one of the boxes and put them in my pocket. Then I went up the hill, Baas, to the place where I saw those goats are kraaled at night behind a reed fence. As I had hoped, no one was watching them because there are no tigers so near this town and man does not steal the goats that are sacred. I went into the kraal and found a fat young ewe which had a kid. I dragged it out and taking it behind some stones,
I made its leg fast with a bit of cord and poured the stuff out of the bottle all over its skin, rubbing it in well. Then I tied the 12 packets of hard poisoned sugar everywhere about its body, making them very fast deep in the long hair so that they could not tumble or rub off. After this I untied the goat, led it near the mouth of the cave and held it there for a time while it kept bleating for its kid. Next I took it almost up to the cave, wondering how I should drive it in, for I did not wish to enter there myself, Baas. As it happened, I need not have troubled about that. When the goat was within 5 yards of the cave it stopped bleating, stood still and shivered. Then it began to go forward with little jumps, as though it did not want to go yet must do so. Also, Baas, I felt as though I wished to go in with it, so I lay down and put my heels against a rock, leaving go of the goat. For now, Baas, I did not care where that goat went so long as I could keep out of the hole where dwelt the father of the serpents who had eaten Bena. But it was all right, Baas. The goat knew what it had to do and did it, jumping straight into the cave. As it entered it turned its head and looked at me. I could see its eyes in the starlight, and Baas, they were dreadful. I think it knew what was coming and did not like it at all, and yet it had to walk on because it could not help it, just like a man going to the devil, Baas. Holding on to the stone I peered after it, for I had heard something stirring in the cave, making a soft noise like a white lady's dress upon the floor. There in the blackness I saw 2 little sparks of fire, which were the eyes of the serpent, Baas. Then I heard a sound of hissing like 4 big kettles boiling all at once, and a little bleat from the goat. After this there was a noise as of men wrestling, followed by another noise as of bones breaking, and lastly yet another sucking sound as of a pump that won't draw up the water. Then everything grew nice and quiet, and I went some way off, sat down a little to one side of the cave and waited to see if anything happened. It must have been nearly an hour later that something did begin to happen, Baas. It was as though sacks filled with chaff were being beaten against stone walls there in the cave. Ah, thought I to myself, your stomach is beginning to ache, eater up of Bena, and as that goat had little horns on its head, to which I tied 2 bags of the poison, Baas, and like all snakes no doubt you have spikes in your throat pointing downwards, you won't be able to get it up again. Then I expect this was after the poison sugar had begun to melt nicely in the serpent's stomach, Baas. There was a noise as though a whole company of girls were dancing a war dance in the cave to a music of hisses. And then, oh then, Baas, of a sudden that father of serpents came out. I tell you, Baas, that when I saw him in the bright starlight my hair stood up upon my head, for never has there been such a snake in the whole world. Those that live in trees and eat bucks in Zululand, of whose skins men make waistcoats and slippers, are but babies compared to this one. He came out, yard after yard of him. He wriggled about, he stood upon his tail with his head where the top of a tree might be, he made himself into a ring, he bit at stones and at his own stomach, while I hid behind my rock praying to your reverend father that he might not see me. Then at last he rushed away down the hill faster than any horse could gallop. Now I hoped that he had gone for good and thought of going myself, still I feared to do so lest I should meet him somewhere, so I made up my mind to wait till daylight. It was as well, Baas, for about half an hour later he came back again, only now he could not jump, he could only crawl. Never in my life did I see a snake look so sick, Baas. Into the cave he went and lay there hissing. By degrees the hissing grew very faint, till at length they died away altogether. I waited another half hour, Baas, and then I grew so curious that I thought I would go to look in the cave. I lit the little lantern I had with me and, holding it in one hand and my stick in the other, I crept into the hole. Before I had crawled 10 paces I saw something white stretched along the ground. It was the belly of the great snake, Baas, which lay upon its back quite dead. I know that it was dead, for I lit 3 wax matches, setting them to burn upon its tail, and it never stirred, as any live snake will do when it feels fire. Then I came home, Baas, feeling very proud because I had outwitted that great-grandfather of all snakes who killed Bena my friend and had made the way clear for us to walk through the cave. That is all the story, Baas. Now I must go wash these dishes." And without waiting for any comment, off he went, leaving us marvelling at his wit, resource and courage. "What next?" I asked presently. "Nothing till tonight," answered Ragnall with determination. "Then I am going to look at the snake which the noble Hans has killed and whatever lies beyond the cave, as you will remember Harût invited us to do unmolested if we could." "Do you think Harût will keep his word, Ragnall?" "On the whole, yes. If he doesn't, I don't care. Anything is better than sitting here in this suspense." "I agree as to Harût because we are too valuable to be killed just now, if for no other reason. Also as to the suspense, which is unendurable. Therefore I will walk with you to look at that snake, Ragnall, and so no doubt will Hans. The exercise will do my leg good." "Do you think it wise?" he asked doubtfully. "In your case, I mean." "I think it most unwise that we should separate any more. We had better stand or fall all together. Further, we do not seem to have any luck apart." Chapter 17